Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the closing day for VMFRP ER Central. Can I just check that can be heard? Thank you. We've got a number of matters to work through today in closing. Firstly, just to note that closing submissions from the proponent were circulated on Monday, so we've got a copy of those, including the final day documents of the EDS, the incorporated document, and I also note there was a technical note 6 related to the Burra Creek project, which the committee had asked for as well. The other thing, in terms of closing today, can I ask if any of the people here are representing Ms. McKay? No, there's been a very large closing submission dropped in the last little while, which is the PowerPoint presentation. Ms. Trowers in our office has managed to PDF it for us so we could actually open it. Could I just check, Mr. Waters, have you seen that or were you able to download that?
No, this is the first I've heard of it. I'll go and have a look.
Okay, thank you. I won't talk about it further if she's not here, but we'll come back to that in due course. Beyond Ms. McKay, can I just ask who else wanted to speak in closing? No, I'm not seeing anyone. Ms. Hogan, did you want to make a brief closing submission?
Thank you, Chair. Yes.
Thank you. And I don't see anyone from the Friends here, but I'm assuming they may wish to as well. We'll just keep an eye on that. The other thing I just wanted to touch on was the response to document 64A. Now, the committee had put a number of questions to the proponent on Thursday. Can I just check, Mr. Waters, the likely timing of a response on that, and then we'll work out how we're going to take that forward?
Yep. Generally speaking, we're aiming for Friday to answer all those questions in writing. The qualification to that, such as it is there are obviously a number of questions. I think it's 17, no, I think it's 18, 19, and 29 that go to further mapping. That mapping doesn't exist. It hasn't been prepared. So we would not be proposing to provide that mapping unless we were very specifically directed to, because we would have to go away and undertake the work, which might take some time to prepare that map. So there will obviously be a textual answer. Certainly in respect of depths, I understand there is numerical data, not mapped data, that goes into a final resolution, but that's what I would want to say about those particular requests then. So I wouldn't want the committee to be expecting mapping, certainly not by Friday.
Thanks, Mr. Waters. Can you, what you do provide on Friday, can you just articulate clearly, and then the committee will consider further whether we do want to direct that that actual mapping be done. So thank you.
Yes.
In terms of business today, we'll have closing submissions. I'll start with the proponent in a minute, and then Ms. Hogan. Now, the document from Ms. McKay is a 27-page PowerPoint. It doesn't technically look to me like a closing submission. It looks more like a restatement of the whole case. But anyway, as I said, we won't talk about that until she's here. Whether she wants to table it or not, we can discuss, but I don't want to do that in her absence. When we go to this afternoon to looking at the documents, the without prejudice discussion, we've had a look through those, and again, we'll ask if anyone wants to make particular points in relation to those, but we're not proposing to work through those line by line. We are proposing primarily an on the papers process after today, where we'll give people perhaps a week. We'll come to the dates in a minute to provide written comments, and then we'll provide those comments back to the proponent, and we'll go from there. Are there any other matters that we need to discuss this morning before we get going? No, I'm not seeing any. In that case, Mr. Waters, we'll go to your closing submission, which is, I don't have the document number in front of me.
It's number 89. I do note that the timetable had us going last. I suppose just so that we could address anything new. If you'd prefer me to go first, I'm very content to go first.
Actually, it is normal for you to go last. I don't have the timetable in front of me. I should have remembered something like that. In which case, Ms. Hogan, we'll go to you first. Just before we do, Dr. Kelly, were you proposing to make closing comments today?
Yes, I just had trouble logging on. Sorry, I'm late.
That's okay. Okay, we'll go to Ms. Hogan, then we'll go to you, Dr. Kelly. Dr. Kelly, do you know if Ms. McKay is coming? We do seem to have had a large document drop, but I'm not sure of what its status or purpose is.
Yes, I think she is. I think she just getting that timetable. Can you tell me what time she's scheduled?
She's not scheduled, so we're going to hear from Ms. Hogan, then we'll hear from you, and then from Ms. McKay. So probably in about half an hour or so, I would expect. And
is there anyone else scheduled?
No, only the proponent, and they'll be going last.
Okay. I can check with her while Miss Hogan's doing it.
Thank you. She's also, I'm not sure if you heard me, she's also tried to upload or has uploaded a very large document. She'll need to tell us what it is when she comes in, because closing is really about responding to the proponent's case. And at a very quick look, it does seem to kind of restate material that was put in submissions last week. But anyway, I'll address that with her. That's not your issue specifically.
Yeah, I haven't seen that document. I didn't dare download it in case it blew up my computer.
Yeah, we had difficulties as well. It's very, very large. Okay, Ms. Hogan, we'll go to you to make your closing statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm appearing on behalf of Environment Victoria. I'll firstly summarise briefly Environment Victoria's key submissions with reference to points of discussion during the roundtable, and I'll secondly briefly respond to the proponent's submission on the relevance of constraints relaxation measures to the assessment of the VMFRP projects. Turning firstly to Environment Victoria's key submissions. In Environment Victoria's written and opening submissions, I've just got some technical difficulties. In Environment Victoria's written and opening submissions, we refer generally across all themes to the need for proper assessment of cumulative, facilitated and indirect impacts, the excessive reliance on adaptive management and the proposed processes and steps taken to facilitate the aspirations of traditional owners. During the roundtable, the proponents' experts confirmed that they were not asked to consider the cumulative, facilitated and indirect impacts on floodplain areas that sit outside of the 9 VMFRP sites, which in our submission will inevitably face degradation as a result of allocated environmental water being diverted elsewhere, that is to the project sites. This approach in our submission means that the environment report has failed to meet the scoping requirements, which require consideration of possible cumulative effects resulting in combination with other existing or proposed projects, particularly in relation to downstream aquatic environments and beneficial water uses, and characterisation of the interaction between surface and groundwater within the project and broader area. In response, the proponent has argued that the projects will not take water away from any other floodplain or area of floodplain and do not exclude any other measure being undertaken consistent with policy for the protection and enhancement of floodplains and by effectively making more water available for environmental watering. The projects, however, must be assessed in their broader factual and legislative context. That is, that the projects are a component of the Sustainable Diversion Limit Adjustment Mechanism, SIDLAM, which in effect enables more water from the Murray-Darling Basin to be allocated for consumptive use, such as irrigation, and reduces the overall volume of environmental water which would otherwise flow through the Murray River and inundate floodplains under the Basin Plan. Experts were unable to comment on the likely fate of floodplains that sit outside of the VMFRP sites, and EV submits that further assessment must be undertaken to understand these potential impacts in the broader region. Experts also responded to questions from the committee and submitters about the adequacy of proposed adaptive management measures. The ER documentation repeatedly referenced traditional owner aspirations, and this is reflected in EDS ACH2 connection to country. Despite this, experts confirmed that the specific aspirations of traditional owners were not considered for the purposes of preparing the specialist assessments, which informed findings on project design, impacts, and benefits. Additionally, it remains unclear whether or not traditional owners were included in multidisciplinary workshops where key decisions were made about project design and construction methods to avoid and minimise impacts. Environment Victoria submits that this approach means that EDS ACH2, the objective to realise traditional owner aspirations for country and water, is unlikely to be achieved without further assessments. Turning briefly to the proponents' submissions on constraints relaxation and their relevance to the current process. The proponent has made submissions to the effect that constraints relaxation measures should not be considered as a project alternative, and the lack of certainty around what could be achieved with those measures means that they should not be included in the environmental assessments for these for NI and VMFRA. The proponent asserts that in conjunction with constraints measures and should proceed on that basis. This is repeated in the proponent's Part C submission. This argument has effectively been made on the basis that the projects were modelled together and conceived of in an integrated state and in the SIDLAM, in an integrated sense, in the SIDLAM draft determination report. And the committee has been asked to proceed on the basis that constraints relaxation measures, consideration of constraints relaxation measures is outside of the terms of reference and scope of matters to be considered by the committee. In response, Environment Victoria submits that the terms of reference are in fact broad enough to cover these topics, and assessment of constraints relaxation measures is plainly required by the scoping requirements. Whether framed as feasible alternatives that would effectively avoid or mitigate the need for infrastructure and deliver greater benefits, or as other proposed or planned projects in the region, proper assessment is needed to understand potential flows that could be delivered with constraints relaxation measures implemented. Specifically, clause 5, subparagraph B of the terms of reference refers to the scoping requirements for these projects. It states that the committee must consider and report on environmental effects and benefits of each project presented in the environment report, their significance and acceptability, having regard to the evaluation objectives in scoping requirements and relevant policy and legislation. The scoping requirements include that the environment report must sufficiently describe the 3 projects and assess their respective likely relevant effects or impacts, as well as assessing any feasible alternatives and mitigation measures that could avoid or reduce relevant impacts for each of the projects. And it must also assess the potential cumulative effects of the project and other Victorian Murray floodplain restoration projects and other existing or planned projects in the area, particularly in relation to downstream aquatic environments and beneficial water uses. The VMFRP is part of a greater package of SIDLAM supply projects, which includes constraints relaxation measures. And in this context, experts have acknowledged the benefits that could be delivered with constraints relaxation measures, including, for example, in relation to the dilution of salinity and transfer of nutrients. In our submission, it is critical to realise that the VMFRP and constraints relaxation measures were not conceived of in a practically integrated sense. In fact, the two have different origins. Constraints relaxation measures and their importance was highlighted in 2011 in modelling which showed difficulty of watering higher floodplain elevations without relaxed constraints. The Murray-Darling Basin Authority then completed 2 modelling scenarios with recovery of 2,800 gigalitres and 3,200 gigalitres of water in 2012. The basin plan includes requirements to prepare. Includes a requirement to prepare a constraints management strategy and acknowledges the importance of constraints to achieve enhanced environmental outcomes. It has also been recognised that 3,200 gigalitres with relaxed constraints is critical to deliver target flows at the South Australian border. On the other hand, the goal of supply measures has always been to provide so-called equivalent environmental outcomes without needing to reduce supply for consumptive use, and has always been the product in our submission of political compromise proposed in 2012 to reduce water recovery targets. While the proponent notes that constraints measures and VMFRP projects were modelled together in 2017, this does not mean that they were in fact developed or considered together. To the extent that they were considered together, this was in a modelling scenario comparing benchmark environmental outcomes with those produced in the supply package modelling scenario. This has no bearing on actual river operations, and it illustrates a perceived gap in what constraints can or cannot achieve. The proponent asserts that constraints relaxation projects alone cannot be considered an alternative, but would operate instead in conjunction with VMFRP infrastructure. If that argument is accepted, detailed consideration of the impacts of constraints relaxation projects in the region must be considered, and is currently absent in the environment report. Ultimately, the proponent has never considered the limits of constraints relaxation in ecological terms, which these projects will presumably meet or work in conjunction with. In conclusion, Environment Victoria submits that further assessment addressing key deficiencies is needed in the form of a supplementary environment report. Specifically, further work must be undertaken to understand the facilitated cumulative and indirect impacts in the broader region and in downstream aquatic environments, not just the project sites as required. Further work must also be undertaken to explain how specific traditional owner aspirations will be realised. Importantly, Environment Victoria submits that this further assessment is crucial before an informed decision can be made about whether the project will deliver an overall improvement for biodiversity in the region and therefore meets the requirements for a native vegetation offset exemption under the planning schemes. In relation to constraints relaxation measures, Environment Victoria notes that the committee does not need to advise or choose between constraints scenarios, but should instead request a supplementary environment report where likely scenarios produced by Victoria and New South Wales are modelled and assessed as feasible alternatives. Environment Victoria accepts that the role is to acknowledge uncertainty and to reduce risk by rigorous assessment of that uncertainty through the environmental assessment process. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Hogan. Could we, I'm assuming you're reading off something there. Could we get a hard copy of that table?
Certainly.
Thank you. Again, it's covered, the submission covers a lot of issues that we were taken to last week. Yeah, again, we'll have to make our call on what we think the scope and the terms of reference is, which I think I've provided our guidance on all the way along. our ability to fix the Murray-Darling Basin system is pretty limited, I think. But anyway, thank you for that. Dr. Kelly, we'll now go to your closing submission. Just before we do, I saw Ms. Thornton is here. Ms. Thornton, the closing today is only for parties from last week. So we have your original written submission, which will be considered, but we're not providing the opportunity for new submissions today from new parties. So just answering that question for you. So your written submission stands, which we have, but we're not providing the opportunity for people to make new submissions today. Dr. Kelly, your closing, please.
Thank you, Mr. Wimbush. That's unfortunate for Ms. Thornton, and we were not aware, or I was not aware, and was not aware to tell her that. I've written some closing submissions that I'll read.
Thank you.
We are like the pawns in a poker game where the game is the water wars. From the mountains to the sea, we have a linear oasis connected by water in a dry land. We have an area which was the highest population of Aboriginal people in Southern Australia, pre-colonisation, and the evidence of that is still there, and we will fiercely protect it. We will protect the cultural landscape and we'll protect the natural landscape. The proposed projects will leave a scar on the VMFRP Park and a scar on our community, with division, confusion, and a sense of being swindled resonating for a very long time. Uncle Vincent Kirby said it best on day 5. Someone turns on the tap, someone turns off the tap, and I would guide you to his comments further on that day. Ecologist Doug Frood made the statement, the key point is that the VMFRP are planning to remove hundreds of large old trees and build a retaining wall, which does not replicate the previous water regime because it is altering the floodplain topography. Fundamentally, it is totally experimental with no certainty of how the vegetation would respond. Forever dependent on operation by people to maintain its operation, which is a very risky proposition, end of quote. Since 1996, we fought for a decade, we fought loggers to stay out of VMFRP Park. And now some of the same guys want to come and log again, this time to push up some dirt. It's ironic that for 20 years, we begged for surveys, for more research into the flora and fauna and the archaeological survey. We had to use our minimal funds to get people like Matt Herring, Doug Frood and Damien Cook to come and do very small surveys within the limits of our budget. We knew that more surveys needed to be done. And although we have piles and piles of folders now with studies and words in them, we still feel that it's not enough. So 27 hectares of native vegetation is going to be damaged, 300 trees, 200 large, 100 very large, 120 hollow bearing trees, and 160 of those trees are going to be completely felled. Planning Panels Victoria, I think, would know that the process is reductionist and limited. The timeliness is difficult. We're on the verge of hopefully changing some of the environmental laws in our country. We're on the verge of possibly giving rivers rights. And yet these projects are going to sneak in and be done in such a limited way. How can this process consider cultural landscape and its intangible values? The Part C submission of the proponents, Lower Murray Water, continues with the fancy beige lawyer speak, spending most of their time saying that you should ignore alternatives and that the constraints measures are an alternative are not an alternative option. This is probably means they are. In part 2 of their Part C submission, point 2, they say, provided the environmental watering program is operated to resemble natural circumstances, it must follow that both the environmental risks and benefits of environmental watering are consistent with the natural circumstances and hence are acceptable outcomes. I find it hard to not call that out as just rubbish. Then in point 8, they say the proponent insinuates that the objectors, which our group would be one, have failed in their participation in the roundtable. I would say far from it. We did have issue with the ER's assessment of benefits or impacts, and we tried to highlight that within our ability. But, you know, we are overwhelmed. We are in shock. We are undermanned and underfunded. And we are underrepresented. Certainly, it was obvious on day 5 that we were not going to buy Hilary Chapman's report. And as the time went on, we probably got a bit more au fait with how the process worked. But the AOIBs, habitat importance mapping, etc., it is the modelling and things like that. It shows it is experimental. It was gallant that it was said in the Part C submission, the overarching benefit of the projects in addressing the ecological design of the floodplain, but so minimal and takes a massive footprint. I feel this is overreach. In 13.3 of Part C submission, the do nothing scenario raises its head again, but surely it's obvious that we have been screaming out for water since 1997. There has never been a time when we have said do nothing. 16.16 in that Part C is we've already made EES, insinuates that the EES decision is already made and urges the ER Central SIAC to follow suit. So just as we object to a cookie cutter approach to these projects, we implore the ER Central Committee to not take a cookie cutter decision and just follow the EES Central. Our attempt was to show you Nyah Vinifera is unique, distinct, and has enough individual merit to deserve its own consideration and decision. 18.1 says refutes that these projects take water away. Yes, they very much do and will take water away from the river. It is disingenuous to say they will not. It's the deal. 18.2, 18.3 considered constraints. PIDOC says they are an alternative. 18.4 calls constraints uncertain and talks about which, when, or how. That detail is there, but what is the problem is that there's a lack of political will. Recently, in a webinar, Paul Bennett from the department said that the Victorian government was going back to the drawing board because there was no community trust. It's all part of the swindle. Oh, that's my comment. It's all part of the swindle. On page 8 of the Part C submission, the quote is, means constraints cannot be considered to be capable of responding to the ecological decline of the floodplain in a timely way, end of quote. So the puppet masters have held up any work on constraints so that this timeliness was the problem. if they had have started working on constraints when they should have, there would have been advancement and it could have been obvious, and when New South Wales and Victoria could have worked together to do the constraints packages. We urge rapid work on constraints to get them done. The 3 floods in 10 years that we've just had do give time. Under the issue of avoidance and minimisation of impacts, number 21 talked about the involvement of council, and we question whether there was any involvement of council. Number 22 talks about the maximal possible extent. And we just think it's a joke that we are meant to just trust that all will be well and we can trust that everything will be fine. We didn't come down in the last shower. Tree loppers, front end loaders, dump trucks, these are not sensitive ways to treat this park and this cultural and natural landscape. Use of cut timber, number 23, unless the land manager is funded and resourced, then any large woody debris that is left in the park from this cut timber will disappear from illegal firewood cutting, which is rampant. 26, surface water and groundwater. Huge impacts, huge risks. And at least it is acknowledged in the reports from Mr. Treadwell and Mr. Hoxley that there are unavoidable impacts. And we have no confidence that risks will be minimised and managed within acceptable parameters. Under ecology, this is not a fish-friendly project. The impact, it's under 29, it says the impact of construction are confined and modest. We refute that. We do not think that they are confined and modest at all. We're worried about the depth level, which was never clarified. Under Aboriginal Cultural Heritage, point 33, we say that you did not, Lower Murray Water did not establish that consultation with the TOs and interested parties was extensive, non-exclusive, open and characterised by respect for the right of persons and groups to participate if and as they determined. To me, this seems like the type of speak straight out of Fortescue Metals Group or Rio Tinto Handbook. 3.35.1, it is not, it says it's the same as natural flooding, therefore, but we feel that it is not the same as natural flooding. I think we've tried to explain that with shear stresses, changed in hydrology. We agree that participation is not consent. It's appalling that no cultural expert or witness was called and not enough time was given in the roundtable to discuss all the issues around cultural heritage. Rather than a discussion, it was evidence of the subterfuge, manipulation. Under climate, Lower Murray Water, quote, the projects are proposed to provide resilience to and afford flexibility in the face of the future uncertain climate. And lastly, under that, Lower Murray Water invites the committee to reach conclusions consistent with those of the EES Central Committee in this respect. Of course it does. So consultation was not an appropriate level. On page 15, lies are told about our involvement in consultation. We did not have a specific member on the CRG. August 21 meeting was a tour given 1 day's notice and could only take 2 people on a bus because it was really a tour for the CRG. And the June 22nd meeting that is mentioned, that was coffee with Peter Walsh, our local MP, and Jane Ryan. And this is not real consultation. This was a chat over coffee. And it was at that meeting that Jane Ryan said that she would be fearful to send her staff to a public meeting, which is such disrespect. There has been no community meeting since 2018. These are very large changes, very involved and detailed and complex projects, and enough information was never given to the community. It was insufficient, superficial, divisive, descending, embarrassing. Farmers markets, keep cups, hats, very dumbed down, no answers to questions, just like a mining company. It was very obvious and has been all the way through that the proponent is happy to lie and to disrespect this community. The EPBC, the feds have let the VIC assess their own project, seems wrong and unfair, and we need to strengthen our laws to protect nature. Under fish, we are not assured by the reports. Under birds, more research on migratory species, the great egret, the jamba and camber listed birds. The experts seemed apologetic, acknowledging that more surveys should have been done after these recent floods to get good data. Traditional ecological knowledge, TKEK, was not included in ecological surveying. We'd like to continue to criticise adaptive management because it's a fail. We were unable to speak about parks management. At the whim of politics of the day, parks management can be cut, funding can be cut. The Northwest is often neglected, out of sight, out of mind. With water, underwater, Mr. Hoxley talked about the narrowness of the floodplain here between the river and the high red sandy sections. It's such a small park compared to most of the other VMFRP locations. Another reason why the cookie cutter approach doesn't work. Much of what the experts said was don't know, didn't consider, out of scope. A walk in Naya a couple of days ago by myself and my family. We saw a great egret. We saw a Nankeen night heron, a juvenile one, a long-necked turtle, several species of water bird, a whistling kite, kangaroos. Mr. Watson said that his 3 surveys were done in dry periods and he would have liked to do them after a flood. Cultural heritage, there was nothing much about scar trees. There was nothing about unregistered marker trees known as ring trees. There was mention of the SIAC report from 2000, but nothing about the Kelton report. We would seek SIAC to look up the Kelton report. Jim Kelton was paid to do a report, and it never saw the light of day because he talked about the cultural landscape and that the landscape is not just discrete sites, but it is a landscape. The most telling indicator that the proponent does not see cultural heritage as important is that they did not put it up as a theme. They did not also bring any expert witnesses. If the hydrology is the cultural heritage, then these projects will destroy cultural heritage and cultural landscape. What we have tried to show is that these areas are too valuable, too precious to experiment on this scale. Not having a RAP has put Wadi Wadi at a disadvantage on the proponents, one the proponents were happy to exploit. Ray Kennedy said that on day 5 said that the surveys were not comprehensive. Kane Chaplin said that the consultation was bad in the early days. So generally, not taken TO input into consideration enough. I'm nearly finished. the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And we hope that you have, it has been obvious that there has been a go slow, that this park was made to look worse than it needed to, which really is gross maladministration. It would seem obvious that we should look at projects in the Living Murray like Kundruk Paracuda. We should look at that regulators in the Gunbow Creek were put in 20 years ago and only recently got a fishway. So reassurances that we don't need more fish-friendly structures are not acceptable. The change that will come into effect if these proposed projects are built will change these sensitive areas. They will recover, but the scar will be irrevocable. I did write that, but I'm having trouble saying it. I'll just lastly quote Doug Froude again. Doug Froude said that these places were fine 20 years ago, and I think Ms. McKay, Councillor McKay, has drawn you to reasons for that. Doug Froude talked about wanting to see the ecological decline addressed in ecologically sound manner, which he does not think these projects are. And the issue of water purely depends on how the political decision about how water is allocated is made. There will be winners and losers from this, the war that I talked about, the water war. And these projects may be well-intentioned, and we don't show any, disrespect to any of the hardworking public servants who work in these departments, but the unintended consequences are perverse. And lastly, in these, in the northwest, in the Red Gum floodplain, there's 500 native animal species. There's 5 nationally listed endangered, 11 vulnerable, 1,500 native plant species, 54 nationally listed endangered, 10 vulnerable, 144 EVCs, of which 135 are endangered, vulnerable or depleted. Naya vinifera is just a small part of that, but it's an important, and we do not think that these projects can be seen discreetly as 9 individual projects. Just as Naya vinifera, you've put them together because they are not 2 discrete projects. They are a whole, affecting the linear floodplains that still exist along the Murray. So the floodplains are sick. There are answers, and I think with the wisdom that we do have in 2023, we can work towards having both biodiversity and future farming viability with much better solutions than these risky, expensive, invasive projects. And in saying that, I just would like to say that I hope that the small tweaks that we might have mentioned in our participation during the roundtable can be taken on board. I will give you a list of them if you seek it. Yeah, apart from that, we will await any further information. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Kelly. As for Ms. Hogan, could I ask that you perhaps just do a summary of that in writing for us? You look like you're reading off something, so if that could be sent in, thank you. Is Ms. McKay here? There's a number of iPhones which may or may not be her. Ms. McKay, are you with us?
Is it possible that after a break she could present? I have got a message from her and it says she's at work, but that was early this morning.
Yeah.
Whether she's allocated time for this, I think she has, but I haven't spoken to her.
She has done a PowerPoint presentation, as I mentioned. If she can't come in, we'll just have to take that as read.
What time was she on the program?
There's not a time on the program. It's just we run through people on the program as convenient. So there's not a specific time.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Waters, have you managed to get access to that PowerPoint slide show yet? Mr. Waters, can you hear me?
I can. Sorry, I was just checking that the table document website has not been updated to include that at this stage. So
it's
no.
in the what I saw it on the documents to be tabled.
Yes, I have been working with the table documents website, not the Google Drive. I will see if I can get someone to flick it to me. I'm content if it would assist to take a 15-minute break now, given that we're obviously not hearing from everyone who's listed. So that might give Ms. Mackay an opportunity to at least nominate whether she'll be able to attend.
Yeah, let's do that. Ms. Strauss, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Gabby, can I ask you to upload the PDF version of the PowerPoint that you've prepared for us?
Yes, I'll do that.
If you can put that into the Google Drive documents to be tabled,
Yeah.
because it is only 8 megabytes rather than the 102 that we couldn't get off earlier.
The document is already available in the documents to be tabled.
The PDF one? Excuse me.
Yeah, the PDF version.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
So anyone who wants to have a look at it, it is in the Google Drive documents to be tabled. Go to the PDF version, not the PowerPoint version. And we'll start again at, let's make it 11:05. If Ms. McKay can come in, then we'll hear from her. Otherwise, we'll go to the proponent and we'll just take her material as read.
I'll try and get in contact with her.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Kelly. That would be appreciated. We'll start again at 11:05. Thank you. Okay, we'll make a start again. Can I just ask again if Ms. McKay has been able to join us? Dr. Kelly, do you have any advice on whether Ms. McKay is able to join us?
I'm sorry, I have been attempting to contact her, but I have not succeeded. I'm not sure if you're aware, but she is a midwife and she works in the local maternity hospital, and sometimes they just get called in.
Sometimes things can't wait. No, she did mention that last week. Just bear with me. I'm just going to go off camera for. I
wondered if we could request, because on the list of today's speakers, there was Ms. McKay, but also Ms. Thornton, and Ms. Thornton has prepared for.
Yeah, I've already mentioned Ms. Thornton. She was listed to speak last week, and then she's also listed to speak this week. But my advice last week was that she couldn't attend the hearing. You need to have attended last week and made a submission to do a closing submission this week. Otherwise, you're not a party. So I'm not opening this up today to non-parties. I thought I made that clear earlier. So I'm not opening it for discussion, Dr. Kelly. I'm just letting you know why Ms. Thornton, like any other one who's come in just today, is not being provided that opportunity to speak. Now, if Ms. McKay's not here, I'm going to go to Mr. Waters to do his closing, and we will just take Ms. McKay's PowerPoint presentation as read. But if you just give me 3 minutes, I'm just going to go off camera and check something. So just bear with me. If everyone can please stand by. Thank you. Okay, what I'm going to suggest we do, Mr. Waters, will go to your closing. I'll get you to go through and complete that. If Ms. McKay then comes in the course of that or just after that, we'll hear from her. And then I'll give you, as necessary, a further right of reply if there's anything that you wish to respond to. I don't want to hold proceedings up waiting for her. We have my office hasn't been able to contact her either. So we'll do that. We'll go to your submission in closing for the proponent. And then if Ms. McKay is with us, we'll come back to her and then give you that further opportunity to do the last right of reply. So when you're ready, Mr. Waters.
Thank you. Perhaps unfortunately, I'm proposing to be very brief today. Unfortunately, in that context, the document is 17 pages. You've had an opportunity to read it. It's not, I think, a highly complex document. So what I'm proposing to do is make really 4 brief points in about 5 minutes, responding to issues that have been raised this morning, and assuming our submission is taken as read, subject to any questions that you might have.
Sorry, just before you go on, did you have the opportunity to review Ms. McKay's PowerPoint presentation?
Briefly, I think is a fair summary. There's obviously a lot of information there. Yeah. There's effectively further reading required to fully comprehend what is being put in there. Yeah. And I can't say I've had the opportunity to undertake that. But the thrust, I think, of it is relatively clear, and that once again, it's emphatic about the desirability of constraints management as an alternative.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank
you.
I think the first point to make is that there has been very little focus in what you've heard this morning, and there was comparatively little put in the hearing that it actually amounts to a detailed critique of the evidence that has been given, the methodologies of assessment, the technical detail of the evidence that has been produced. And that's significant, we say, because one is entitled to be skeptical, if one wishes, of the submissions that are put and the evidence that's put, but you don't get to dismiss it just because you're skeptical of it. These are well-qualified experts. Their evidence hasn't been seriously challenged. Their methodology hasn't been seriously challenged. You can always do more survey work. That's why, for example, at the federal level, there are specific standards about the degree of survey effort required for, in particular, migratory bird species. Merely saying, well, you could have done more work is not an answer to the quality of the work that has been done. And in some places, no doubt more work will be done, particularly around traditional owner matters, which I'll come to further in a minute. No evidence was led that the projects will not have ecological benefits. Again, one can be skeptical of the process that was adopted for the AOIBs, yes. And we have sought to emphasize the purposes for which they were produced in our submissions, particularly around the reliance on habitat modeling. Those were in response to specific requests, and they really arise in the context of the specific conservation works type exemption that's replicated in our incorporated document to be consistent with the scheme. But again, no one has actually come forward, and in particular, no one is qualified. In particular, I know that it wasn't submitted by the people from the Fenner School that this wasn't a good thing in the sense of additional watering being a good thing, but rather that they would prefer to see it done in a different fashion. The focus of objective submissions has in fact been on almost exclusively in terms of alternatives. And it's been put that constraints relaxation is a real alternative. Now, we have sought, despite our view that it is not in scope, to explain why it's not a feasible alternative and why, even if it is considered, it doesn't produce equivalent results. And in particular, I'll just point you to the table at our 18.3 that clearly sets out what can be achieved by environmental works and what can be achieved by constraints relaxation, and you'll appreciate that they are not the same thing. In particular, we've emphasized in our submissions that, and the evidence that Dr. Treadwell supports, and the studies by ecological associates, including, I believe, Mr. Frood, demonstrate that what you want is long period flooding, long duration flooding for these areas. And there's no evidence you'll get that with constraints. My understanding of the material that's been advanced is maybe in the order of a week or so. And again, constraints doesn't get you flooding when the river's low. So they are different things, they do different things, they have different benefits, and they serve different functions. They're not alternatives. At best, they're complementary. But even beyond that, you know, it's this sort of never theory of constraints relaxation, where it said, oh, well, if we just relax constraints, it'll all be fine. No one articulates what they are. EV is well qualified and has in other matters brought expert evidence. It could easily have brought expert evidence, or at least articulated what specific scenarios it said should have been modeled. We acknowledge that might be more difficult for parties who do not have the resources of larger and well-established NGOs. But, you know, once again, it's equivalent to just saying, oh, well, we'll just leave it and hope for the best. It said, well, no one's calling for doing nothing, but not doing this and just waiting and hoping for constraints management is at least a form of doing nothing, at least in the short term, and potentially for longer. Finally, I just want to speak to the issue of traditional owner involvement. Once again, we re-emphasize the significance and importance of the cultural heritage management process as a separate and parallel process, which constrains the carrying out of these projects, as we've noted, and which does provide an opportunity and suitable confidentiality regimes for traditional owner groups to have input into this project. We've also, and again, I'd encourage you to look at our Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Impact Assessment, sought to, and the Alternatives Assessment, sought to place a very high priority on the avoidance of impacts on Aboriginal cultural heritage, because we do recognise the significance of these areas. Obviously, you've heard what you've heard on day 5 about consultation, and we'll leave it to your judgment to say what you want to say about that. The other final matter, some comment was made by Ms. Hogan regarding EDS2 and the incorporation of traditional owner aspirations for these areas. The traditional owner aspirations for these areas are set out in section 3.5.2 of chapter 6 of the ER. Many of them extend strictly beyond what this project involves. For example, aspirations to co-management of Nara and Vinifera Park, which may very well be a good policy idea. We don't take a position on that as part of this process. but insofar as they do relate to ecological restoration, avoidance of impacts on areas of sensitivity, we say these projects are entirely consistent with that. The fact that we might not have explicitly pointed to the linkages between particular aspirations and particular assessments doesn't change that. We have sought to avoid impacts on Aboriginal cultural heritage. We don't need to draw your attention to the fact that the traditional owners seek to avoid impacts on their heritage. That's obvious. And the final point is ACH2 has work to do in terms of things like designing environmental watering regimes, which again is another of the aspirations identified in 3.5.2. We have not been prescriptive about when we're going to water, etc. at this stage, because that is a process that should be designed taking into account Aboriginal cultural heritage values, including restoration of medicine plants and consistency with other values that they have. So there are continuing opportunities and obligations to take that information into account. And those are really the matters I wanted to address you on this morning, subject to any questions.
Thanks, Mr. Waters. Mr. Blake or Dr. Briscoe, any questions? And I should have asked that of our previous submitters as well. If you've got others you wish to raise with our previous submitters, please do now.
No, I don't.
I don't either.
Thank you both. Now, our final call for Ms. McKay. And I'll just check. Gabby, could you indicate if you've had any further contact or any contact?
No, Chair, I haven't heard from her.
Thank you.
Mr. Bush,
yeah.
I just want to say that we're all volunteers. We all have work.
I'm not complaining about her not being here. If she was here, we would be very, very happy to hear from her. She contributed a lot last week. So we have her extensive written PowerPoint, which is 27 slides or 29 slides. So we will work through that in detail, even though she hasn't been able to attend today. I do, as I said, I think in closing last Thursday, appreciate that, you know, some people in this process are professionals and paid to be here, many are not, and we do understand that creates difficulties.
Just so we're really down to, you know, as a community, we're disillusioned and tired, and
yeah, you use some.
It's been tough.
You used some fairly clear words in your submission, which I heard quite clearly. So thank you for that. Okay, we'll just keep an eye out in case she drops in. The other task for today, just bear with me. The other task is to look at those the documents that I've been talking about in the environmental delivery standards. If I can, I'll just go to the document numbers. Just bear with me. No, it's killed my file manager. Mr. Waters, can you perhaps just read out the document numbers for the approval documents, the EDS and so on?
The update, do you need to, we've only got one version of the EMF. Do we need to go to that?
If you can just read it out, just so that people can hear it.
Yep, so the EMF is 20.
Thank you.
The final versions of the other two documents are 84 and 85.
Thank you. So as indicated last week, those are the, if the project were to be approved, those are the documents that the minister would apply to any approval of the projects. The role of the committee is to provide a copy of those documents to the minister with our recommendations as to what should be in them. And as also indicated last week, that's on a without prejudice basis. So even if we advise the minister that the project shouldn't proceed for whatever reason, we would still provide her with a copy of those documents as marked up as best as possible. So the environmental management framework, the incorporated document, and the environmental delivery standards, there have been of the not including the environmental management framework, which is document 20 from some days ago. The other two have been updated and tabled on Monday by the proponent. I'm going to, as I said at the start of today, provide the opportunity for people to respond to those in writing. So the committee will write, hopefully this afternoon, if not tomorrow, to the parties in this process, asking if they wish to comment on those approval documents on a without prejudice basis. We'll give, today is Wednesday, we'll give in the order of a week for people to do that if they do have comments on those documents. But I did just want to ask, are there specific comments on the documents that people wanted to table today or raise issues today with things that they should be in there? The opportunity to do it in writing is there as well, but just in terms of if there is something that people actually want to speak about those without prejudice approval documents, now is the opportunity to do it.
Do I have to put my hand up?
Dr. Kelly, I can see you've come off mic, please.
Oh, look, those documents are a little bit too complex for me and my resources and time available, but thank you for allowing us to write something. We might get time to do that. Of course, we are hoping we never have to consider those things as happening, but one thing that comes to mind is the Taksuka Bank, and I think it's been highlighted that our planning scheme is not adequate to protect that bank as a heritage site. So I would like added into the I don't even know what you're calling them, EDS, I call them the specs, that sufficient protection of that is, consult with Swan Hill Rural City, get a proper planning overlay over that to protect the whole thing, perhaps a management plan for it. The more I look at it, the more I become aware again that it is a very significant heritage place, and it needs to be protected more. I also, after looking at the documents more, see that there is possibly some public land that has been removed from the park, a triangle of land that seems to be more wooded that was on the original maps. And I would ask the proponent if they want to comment on that. Did they discover that there was some public land that was now had become private land, a triangle that is on the earlier maps that I'm not sure if it's so. There seems to be a little bit of lack of clarity there as to the tenure of the land, the adequacy of the planning scheme over heritage overlay. So I would like to meet with the proponent and discuss much more about what goes on there and removing any potential as possible for damaging that site.
Yeah, as discussed in some detail last week, that's an issue that's clearly before us. So we'll be looking at that in detail. The Taksuka Bank issue I'm talking about. The triangle site, I'm not entirely sure what you're referring to, but Mr. Waters, I think, indicated clearly last week that there's no private land to be acquired. So whatever they're working with would be public land, is my understanding.
what it looks like from the maps is that there's a triangle of land that was public land that now is managed as private land. So the fences have gone up possibly across that land. And I may be making assertions that aren't true, but I've never looked at the maps before, unless that triangle of land was purchased or given to the private landowner. The possibility that there's more park than we seem. So
can you tell me roughly where that is, and I'll look it up on VicMap to later to see what the tenure is.
Yep. If you look at those maps in appendix, I'll go to volume 5, assessments G to I. If you look at say page 48, which is
yeah, perhaps if you can just describe it to roughly where it is, and I'll go and have a look. You don't need to give me the exact reference.
If you say are at the river and you come along the Takasuka track or the Takasuka bank.
So in VMFRP, yeah.
And it goes, it's heading west, and then it turns and goes obliquely across. It seems like there's possibly some private land there, public land. I just feel like the boundary has possibly.
Yeah, I'll have a look at it on VicMap just to try and match up what's what's private and what's public.
Yeah, look specifically at page 39 in that specialist assessment G, historical heritage, and you can see that the map figure 5.7, the composite map of 1959 and 1972 parish of Tintinda West, the parkland looks like it goes further, and then yeah, I think the boundaries at some time been changed. It would seem strange that some of the park is annexed off.
Yeah,
I would think that possibly.
Again, we're not setting the project boundaries, but I will have a look at it on the state mapping system.
We may be able to rectify. You want the park to be expanded, not reduced.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Decker, Mr. Decker, you've come on camera. Did you want to say anything?
Thank you, Member Wimbush. I was a little bit torn. I wasn't sure whether I needed to or not, but DECA is satisfied with the final day version. However, there has been some commentary made around some of the conditions with respect to native vegetation and native vegetation policy, and I thought there may be some merit, but there may not be a need to. I guess I'm in your hands in terms of a matter of process or preference with respect to submitters making a submission as it relates to native veg conditions and what our views on those might be. Do we just leave it in that we are happy with the final day version? And if the committee or somebody would like our advice around some changes to those conditions, we just wait for that, or do we sort of get on the front foot and we see something and advise?
If it's changes to the approval documents, which I'll call them, the without prejudice approval documents, then you should after today. But if there are things about those approval documents that it would be useful to put on the table now, then you should do so. I'm not quite sure what you're aiming at. Is it the?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't articulate it very well. We are satisfied with the final day version of the Inc. doc. I think it's okay to note that Environment Victoria are suggesting that parts of the native veg conditions with respect to removing written agreement from the Secretary, and what our views might be on that.
Yeah, so what we'll do, we'll get you to put that in writing on the documents, we'll gather up any submissions that come in with comments on those documents, and again we'll give them to the, as is normal, we'll give them to the proponent to do a final response on their view, and then we will make of it all as we will. I'm hearing you say that you're happy with the final day documents, but not quite. I'm a little bit confused.
Oh,
but
no, so we are happy with the final day versions of the ink doc.
Yep.
I understand that Environment Victoria have proposed that there be amendments to the ink doc to remove written agreement from the secretary.
Okay.
And just whether or not there is merit in us offering a view on that. So it's only in response to a submitter. It's not in response to the final document itself.
I think we'll just get all the comments in, and then we'll make a call on where we go from there.
Right.
If we think it's something significant and we are thinking going with Environment Victoria, for example, in this case, then yes, if it impacted significantly on DECA's position, then we would probably need to go back to DECA to get their views as well. But I'd rather see it clearly written out than kind of speculating on exactly what it might say or might not.
Thank you. Yes, sorry, I was a little torn, so I'm happy to be directed.
Thank you. We're going to move to a close. I'm still not seeing.
Sorry, Mr. Wimbush, if I could just make two brief comments on the documents. One, you'll have seen the correspondence which was tabled from EPA requesting a change to NV1 or a readjustment to NV1 to reflect its original intent. That has been picked up in the final days. It's just an error that caused it to fall out.
So that's in the version circulated on Monday, as I understand it.
Yes, it is. So you should have that. And just in relation to the issue that Mr. Decker had just raised, we obviously support the documents as proposed. The conservation works exemption is an exemption found in standard state policy at 5217 or state controls of EPPs. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be available to a project of this nature, whether that's via an incorporated document or 5217. That's all we say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. So just again, just tidying off on a couple of matters from our point of view, we will provide correspondence to parties to provide a written response on all those without prejudice approval documents. We're expecting the material on Friday in relation to our direction, or rather the list of questions in 64 capital A. We will, of course, circulate that response for parties to, again, provide a written response if they wish to. And then we will move towards finishing that off. We have, just in terms of timing from here, we have timing requirements in the terms of reference, which we'll be sticking to. We are still, there will still be a number of documents floating around after the event, so we'll take those into consideration. We are also waiting for advice on the Burra Creek project at some point as to a more final timeline for when that may come back to this committee, or indeed another committee of SIAC, but probably to this committee. Just Dr. Briscoe and Mr. Blake, are there any questions you have, I guess, particularly of the proponent in relation to those draft without prejudice approval documents? Otherwise, we'll go away and think about them and see the responses that we get in writing. Any questions, though, at this stage? Mr. Blake, you're on mute.
So just one or two questions to Mr. Waters. The interpretation of mitigation measures, the term mitigation measures in the incorporated document, this would encompass adaptive management?
Now I'm on mute. Yes, it would. Adaptive management is an important part of the mitigation regime.
This may be a question to Mr. Decker. There are precedents for granting conservation works exemption from offset requirements.
Thank you, Member Blake. I will need to take that on notice. I'll have to confer back with some colleagues and see where it has been applied and how it has been applied. Going off the top of my head wouldn't offer much benefit.
Okay. Have there, well, related to that, have the guidelines, conservation work exemption, further guidance for large or complex projects, have they actually been applied to another posed exemption from offset requirements? And I might just ask parenthetically there, Mr. Waters might be able to respond. Are those guidelines explicitly addressed in the environment report documentation? I see the reference, but are they actually addressed?
No one's got anything to say on that?
Oh, sorry, I thought the question was posed to Mr. Waters.
The latter one.
Sorry, Mr. Waters, do you have any advice on that?
Not immediately, is the short answer.
And I'll roll the second question up into the first one and,
Yes,
and take that as I understand it, 2 questions. One, has the conservation works exemption, are there examples of where the conservation works exemption has been applied? And secondly, have the guidelines that have been tabled or documented, have they been applied previously as well?
Yes. And I think just one other one from me, in relation to the EDS, I didn't detect any reference to consultation with New South Wales authorities. But one EDS that I was wondering about that is in relation to LV1, in light of the apparent potential visual impacts of works when viewed from the Murray or its northern banks. Is there any reference in the EDS to consultation with New South Wales authorities, or do you have a preliminary comment about that?
I haven't seen any reference to it. In principle, there is no reason why a person in another jurisdiction could not be a person affected. My understanding is much of that land is in private ownership, so it wouldn't be a case of, for example, consulting with the Parks Authority. But subject to any further instructions in the group chat, it would apply as it applies, and in accordance with its terms, which in some cases might involve consultation with people outside the jurisdiction.
The chair might provide me direction here about a question that I'd like to ask of another question, Mr. Decker, about the approvals which fall within the Decker portfolio under the National Parks Act and the Crown Lands Reserves Act, and also under the Water Act, in terms of the scope of those decisions under the in 27, Section 27 National Parks Act, Section 17 of the Crown Land Reserves Act, and Section 67 of the Water Act, whether those decisions can be conditioned.
Just bear with me, Member Blake. I'm just noting that down. That was Section 27 of the National Parks Act. I missed the section of the Crown Land Reserves.
17 of the Crown Land Reserves Act.
Crown Land Reserves Act.
And Section 67 of the Water Act.
Section 67.
Yes, whether those respective decisions can be conditioned, and any guidance which might relate to that conditioning, such conditioning.
I'll have to take that on notice.
Sure,
I'm familiar enough with Section 67. I'll have to double check on the Section 17, the Crown Land Reserves, Section 27 of the National Parks Act, whether there may be some degree of delegation or Parks Vic responding or being responsible to the National Parks Act rather than DECA, but I'll have to double check, and I'm not quite familiar with Section 17, the Crown Land Reserves Act, whether that's landowner or land manager consent. We'll have to double check if that's where those sit, and I will provide it as part of our questions taken on notice with respect to conservation work exemption and these other approval matters.
Thank you, Mr. Decker, and that's all from me, Member Wimbush.
Thanks, Mr. Blake. Just bear with me. Okay. As I said, we're going to move to a close. Just a final note on further material. After we close in a few minutes, we don't accept any more material except that which has either been already promised, such as that Mr. Decker was just talking about, or material that we direct be provided. There was a significant number of documents tabled on Monday from the Friends, so they're in the document list, and we'll go through those and have a look at those in due course. But in terms of new material, once the hearing closes today, the only material we should be receiving is that which we have specifically asked for, such as the comments on the without prejudice approval documents. So if there's any, obviously we're including Ms. McKay's final submissions and the two final written submissions to come from Dr. Kelly and Ms. Hogan. But in terms of new material from now on, we won't be accepting anything else. So,
Mr. Wimbush, sorry, sir.
Yes,
I've just
Mr.
been
Waters.
asked to confirm that obviously we'll be providing some other written responses to questions on notice in addition to 64A.
Yep. So, and what are those?
Not sure I've got a specific list. I've just been asked to.
If they're responses, specific responses to our questions, then yes, that's fine.
That's right. So that you asked, for example, some questions of Mr. Bernier, and of Dr. Hoxley. So we will be putting them in. It's just we wanted to be clear we weren't confining ourselves to 64A.
Okay, and Friday as well. Is that your suggested timing for those?
The general aim.
Okay, so once we've received those, or once they're tabled, we will then write to parties, again offering the opportunity for a final comment on those, on that new material as well. Thank you, Mr. Waters. Okay, Dr. Kelly, you're off mute. Did you have anything you wanted to add at that stage before I draw the matter to a close?
No.
Thank you. As I said last Thursday, thank you to everyone who's participated in the process. These processes can be quite grueling for all involved. We will be off, subject to the new material that's to be circulated and received. We'll be working on our report and providing that to the Minister in the timeframes that we've been provided. And just to reconfirm, we will be providing a report on these two projects, with the Burra Creek project report to come at a later stage to be determined. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to close there, and we will get to drafting some directions about the material that's still to come in. So thank you very much, and good morning to everyone.